Hey guys, it's time for another middle of the night, late night video. I don't know, there's something about doing these during the day that just doesn't sit right with me. Maybe it's because I in my room here, I'm sitting by a very large window, which the shades are closed just about all the time, but I'm aware of activity out there, and the window is literally the size of the wall. It's too big. And I hear, people sometimes walking by and blah, 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 because I'm on the ground floor. And, none of these things happen at night. So I was thinking of, like probably a lot of people that are into, I guess I'll say jazz, because it's mostly affected the jazz community. I can't keep up with all the people and the personal favorite musicians of mine that have been passing away this year, but it even started before this year, though. I want to say the last 2 or 3 years. I'm getting to the point where I've got like maybe a half a dozen favorite musicians left, and I'm getting superstitious. I don't even want to speak their names because I'm afraid something's going to happen to them. One of those in the category of like my favorite half dozen musicians was Harold Budd, and he passed away recently, which makes me not even want to speak the names of the others that are personal favorites of mine that are still around. But I do want to send them an email if I had their email addresses and say, you know what, lock yourself in the house, don't see anybody at all. I don't care if they're relatives, if they're your spouse, whatever. And just don't see anybody. Just go on the computer and talk to people that way, and lock yourself away. Whether it's coronavirus or whether it's something else. Who did we lose this week? Alone, which might date the video a little bit. Chick Corea passed away unexpectedly at the age of 79. And Milford Graves, the percussionist, also at the age of 79, passed away. And I got the idea. I've had several ideas for videos lately, and I haven't filmed them. And I was going to do a video on just showing just some favorite albums by folks that had recently passed away. Then it got to the point that there's been so many that recently passed away that I could do an 18-hour video. So I didn't want to not do the video, so I decided the only way to do this is to kind of break it down, and then when you start preparing for it, other things come into view. So I'm going to start, and this kind of has a little bit of a mix to it, because the initial impetus of doing this was one of the musicians did pass away recently, but he was part of a group or a collective of musicians where the other members have passed away in recent years, but not this year. But in order for me to show, I kind of wanted to talk about the other musicians that have passed away from this kind of cooperative group. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and kind of break my own rules and start off, I guess, with showing you an album that all three of the musicians that I'm going to briefly talk about today were in. And that is, in this case, the cello player, David Darling, another personal favorite of mine, a guy that I got to meet and talk to once at a performance. And you just got to excuse me here while I'm toying with things. David Darling passed away in January 2021. One of my favorite albums, and this has been shown a bit in my circle anyway, in my limited circle of VC people that I watch, this album Gallery, which came out, I think in 83, was it? 82? Came out in 82. I bought this as a new release. back in the days before all this history stuff comes from before the internet, when I used to go to record shops pretty much weekly. If I didn't go every week, I was going every other week. And at that time, unless you were dealing with pop music, you had no idea something new was coming out. You didn't know it till it was up on the shelves. So I'd go into the jazz section and look for my favorite ECM artists, because ECM I had been into for only a few years at that point. And I saw this album by a bunch of guys that I was familiar with their work already, and I'm like, wow, it's a new cooperative group, and that's Gallery, and this is the only album they ever made. It never came out on CD, but recently, and I want to say just within the last 6 months or so, it actually came out as digital downloads. So ECM is releasing some of these old albums as downloads only. I haven't bought the download yet, but it's got to be better than my crackly old vinyl, because I played this a lot. So this was a cooperative group. Five men in the group. David Darling on cello, who, as I mentioned, passed away in January 2021. One of my favorite drummers in the world, Michael DiPasqua, who passed away in 2016, I believe it was. And David Samuels, the vibraphone marimba player, who passed away in 2019. Now, all three of these guys, I've loved their music for decades, since late 70s, very early 80s. And, man, I'm still not over Mike DePasqua, the drummer's passing away from 2016. I still get choked up when I think about it or when I listen to one of his albums. No less than Dave Samuels and David Darling just very recently. The other two guys in the album were Paul McCandless, who thankfully is still with us. Paul McCandless I knew from Oregon. He's one of the founding members, still a member of Oregon. He's started to slow down his musical activities, or at least touring in recent years. He's fairly old now, so you could understand why. And Ratso Harris, the bass player. Now, I saw Gallery play live once, and it was a couple years after this album came out. And I remember I got to talk to Paul McCandless, and I asked him if it was possible if Gallery would make another album, and he said, oh, it's always possible. At the time I saw them, Ratso Harris was not playing with them, the bass player on this album. And I know they did other gigs as Gallery, and there was some personnel changes in the band. And I get the feeling that Ratso Harris was a guy that was kind of available for this album, but I don't really think that he played very much with the band. And he's one of the guys that did not get a writing credit either. So I think he might have been a guy that was available, that somebody in the band knew. I don't find any other history with Ratso Harris playing with the other guys in the band at all. Now, when I saw them, Ratso Harris was not playing bass. It was Mark Johnson. And if Mark Johnson was pretty young back then, but he had already made a name for himself. Fantastic bass player, and his the only time I've seen Mark Johnson play live. But his performance he fit in so well with the band. Now, Mark Johnson had played very, very late in his career. I want to say he might have even been the last bass player for pianist Bill Evans. If he wasn't, I think he was the last bass player. If he wasn't, he was very much at the end of Bill Evans' career. And Mark Johnson went on to play with Jan Abercrombie in a trio with Pete Erskine. That was a hell of a trio. He's made albums as a leader. So he's had a nice career, and he's a fantastic bass player. And he was the bass player when I saw Gallery. And they had a drummer filling in for Mike DePasqua, who to me is one of the guys you can't replace in this band. Maybe that's because I love Mike DePasqua so much, but Mike DePasqua actually did write one of the pieces for this album. And I think the only reason that Mike DePasqua did not play with Gallery when I saw him is because at that time he was on tour as the drummer for the Jan Garbrick group. And by strange coincidence, the very night before in New York City, Jan Garbrick's quartet with Mike DePasqua played a gig in New York City, which I attended. It was a Saturday, and Paul McCandless was in the audience because the very next day here in New Jersey, Gallery was playing a concert at a local college on a Sunday afternoon, and it was a free concert. I believe it was a free concert because Dave Samuels, at the time, was teaching at that college. He was a music teacher at that college. So the Gallery boys had come down to do this concert, and it was Paul McCandless on the reeds and the horns, and Dave Samuels on the vibraphone, and David Darling on cellos. And that was 3 of the 5 guys that were on this original album that they put out. And Mark Johnson, as I said, was in on bass, kind of taking over Ratso Harris's place. And there was a drummer who I have to think was probably a music student from the school because he was much younger than the other guys, and kind of taking Mike DiPasqua's place because DiPasqua was off touring with Jan Garbarek. So this is the one album that the 3 guys I'm going to talk a little bit about here have in common. All 3 of them are on. David Darling, as well as Mike DiPasqua, and Dave Samuels. So what I wanted to do when it comes to these guys that have passed away recently, and I guess it's up to you whether you in Mike DiPasqua's case, consider 2016 recently. I do, but then I'm old. So I wanted to show just a couple personal favorite albums by these guys. And this is probably the first David Darling solo album I ever bought. I remember exactly where I was in the store when it came out. It's an album just called Journal October, Solo Cello. It was recorded October 1979, came out in 1980, and I remember the day that I went into the record store, and I'm flipping through the racks to see what's there. I must have known who David Darling was, and I was already an ECM fanatic. But I remember thinking that I knew his playing, and I can't think of where exactly. I mean, it would have been a sideman somewhere. And I saw this, and the solo albums like this are my personal favorites. Musician goes into the studio, overdubs, plays all the instruments himself. In this case, David Darling is playing multiple cellos, acoustic and electric cellos. Some of the electric cellos are processed in different ways, so there's a lot of variety of sound on here. He also plays a little bit of percussion and gongs and things like that, bells, timpani. Does a little bit of voice on there, and the album probably comes off as weird to a lot of people. And it's probably the most intense and out there, quote-unquote, album he ever made, certainly as a solo thing. David went on to make many, many, many solo albums where he was the sole musician. Those are my favorite types of albums. But most of them carry a certain mood or are closer to like a classical kind of thing. Some of them are like live in the studio type of things of just solo cello. A lot of them have multiple overdubs, but none of them get as deep and I don't want to say the word weird, but kind of there's a more experimental bent to this. And this was actually his very first solo album, and it was nice that ECM put it out. They've put out quite a lot of his solo albums, but he's also done a lot of albums for other labels through the years. And some noteworthy labels in America that were close to kind of like the new age thing, and a lot of those albums are very pretty. They would be a good introduction to people that aren't quite into the avant-garde or the more experimental nature. But for me, this is like this is a great late night album to listen to. Fantastic album, and I've got so many solo albums by him that it's funny that one of my other favorite albums by David Darling isn't a solo album in terms of him playing alone. I believe this was the second album that he put out on his own, just called Cycles. And usually, certain artists, when they make solo albums, those are my go-to listen to albums before anything else. But I gotta admit, he got it right. He's 5 different musicians on this album. And this one was recorded in 1981, November 81. And so I think this was his next one after Journal October. Came out in 82. Again, I was lucky I saw it in the stores when it came out. Quite a band on here. Oscar Castro Neves on guitar, who this is the first time I knowingly heard him, but he had played with other folks that I had heard his playing on without knowing who was on guitar. The great Harold Anderson on upright bass, Steve Kuhn plays piano, Jan Garbrick plays saxophones, and the late great Colin Walcott plays sitar, tabla, and percussion, as well as David Darling's cello. The interesting thing with this album, it's like about 45 minutes, is so you have 6 different musicians. I don't think all 6 of them play on any one of the tracks. There's such a nice mixture of music on here because the musicians are used in different groupings. I'm not sure. I think there is even 1 or 2 short. I could be wrong. I think there's a solo track on here, but I could be wrong. I know there's a couple duet soundtracks with different musicians, so one might just have guitar on it. And then you have a whole bunch of different trio settings, with like David Darling on cello, Garbrick on saxophones, Colin Walcott playing sitar and or percussion, and 1 or 2 things where there's like 5 pieces, but not the full 6 pieces on there. And there's such a variety of settings. You know, some have percussion, some don't, so the ones without percussion are a little more subdued and quiet. And there's a couple wild things when Garbrick goes off a couple times like he does on his saxophone, if you know his playing. But there's such a variety of stuff on here, and that I like it even better than some of his solo things. Like I said, I'm a solo nut, so this is another high point of a David Darling's career for me. I just hit the microphone with the LP cover, so I hope it didn't make this huge sound. Here's another one I've spoken about that's very interesting that came along in recorded in 83. Came out probably late 83 or early 84. David Darling, Terje Repdal, just the 2 of them. You know, very unusual combination of very processed electric guitar, if you're familiar with Terje Repdal's playing, and David Darling on his multiple overdubbed cellos. In a lot of cases on this album, David Darling is doing most of the bass that Terje Repdal plays under. He's playing percussively arpeggios on the cello and then overdubbing other things on the cello, while Terje Repdal is soloing over the top of it. Terje also plays a bit of a synthesizer on here, which is used kind of as a backdrop, really only at a couple points, making a nice kind of blanket sustained chords for the guitar to play over. But this is a particularly interesting album as well, so I had to show that. And I'm keeping this down to only a few albums for the folks that I'm showing. Where do I go next? Now I have to flip through things. So talking about Dave Samuels, the Vibes player, and in addition to that gallery album being a real good place to hear him. Now, Dave Samuels, I didn't know this. When I first got into Dave Samuels, I knew him as an ECM artist because that's where I first discovered him. And it was many, many, many years later that I discovered he was part of Spyro Gyra, and even in the early days. I didn't know that because I never listened to Spyro Gyra. I knew who they were, I knew the kind of music they did, and the kind of playing that Dave Samuels did on his ECM albums and the other albums I heard him on was more of a chamber jazz thing. So I would never associate Dave Samuels with Spyro Gyra. Many, many years later, I bought some Spyro Gyra stuff, And of course, this is all before the internet. And all of a sudden, there's Dave Samuels playing, and I thought he was just a guest on that particular album. But then I did some digging, and I see, oh, he's on like most of these early albums of theirs, and that he was. I don't know to what extent he toured with the band, because he was, I think, generally either teaching or involved in other projects. But he was on most of their early studio albums and continued to be a guest for many years. But I didn't know that about him for many years. And in addition to the Gallery album, here's a particular favorite place to hear him. Double Image, which initially was a quartet. An interesting concept. It was a 4-piece band with Harvey Schwartz on upright bass, Mike DiPasqua on drums. So here's another connection Mike DiPasqua has with Gallery and with Dave Samuels and the subject matter of this video. Harvey Schwartz on bass, Mike DiPasqua on drums, and Dave Friedman on vibraphone and marimba, along with Dave Samuels on vibraphone and marimba. So you had 2 vibraphone marimba players in a band. So it's a very interesting concept. They made, I want to say, 2 or 3 albums as a quartet. I'm aware of 2 of them. And this was one of them. This was 78, I want to say. Yeah, October 78, an album that came out in 79. And this is one of those ECM albums that never came out on CD, but I think this may be one of the ones that recently came out as downloads, so you can actually get the album as downloads. I could be wrong, but I think this one did come out as download. A very interesting album. Dave Samuels wrote 2 of the 4 tracks on the album. Harvey Schwartz, the bass player, wrote 1. Dave Friedman, the other vibraphone player, wrote 1 track as well. This is a good album. Good album. And a good place to hear Dave Samuels play. Now, interestingly enough, this Double Image band with Dave Friedman that Dave Samuels did, it was like an on-again, off-again thing. And a number of years later, they would sporadically do albums. And I guess after 1979 or so, or 80, they broke the band down to just a duo without a rhythm section. So it was just Dave Samuels and David Friedman, the 2 vibraphone players, without bass and drums. And they made several albums in that setting. And as you can imagine, the music's very different because now you no longer have a rhythm vamp going on for somebody to solo over and the traditional rhythm section thing going on. But one of my favorite one, definitely that they did as a duo, they still called it Double Image, was In Lands I Never Saw, which was in somewhere around 1988 or so. I remember hearing this on the radio, which is where I found out it had come out. And I think I had a special order of the CD. It wasn't, one that was regularly in the shop. It was on Celestial Harmonies, which at the time was, very readily available. But, you had to find a well-stocked record store. So I really like this. It's very different because you don't have that rhythmic bottom to it, just to hear the 2 vibraphone players. It's obviously it's lighter, probably a bit more composed, very clear where the sections are where they would improvise over. But a real fine album, and a very good late night album because it doesn't have that rhythm thing going on. Where else do I go? Oh, hold on. I've been doing this all wrong. Let me see. So the one guy left that has passed away from the Gallery group and Double Image as well, for that matter, is Mike DePasqua, who passed away in 2016. I still can't get over the fact that he passed away. There's 3 drummers that could play in that. John Christensen, the Norwegian drummer, who, by the way, just recently passed away this year, I guess 2020 as well. John Christensen passed away, which just floored me. He was my favorite drummer. There were only 2 drummers that could play in that style. He had developed this whole new style for playing drum kit, especially in jazz, but the concept kind of goes beyond jazz. And that's not necessarily all the time playing rhythms, but using the drums more to create like a dynamic tension and to make the music build. And almost like I always use the example, like you would hear if you heard an orchestra with a timpani player. And the timpani player always comes in, during times when the music is building and then building down kind of thing. That's how John Christensen played drums, and I love that style. It took me a while to get it, but I loved it. The only two guys that I ever heard that really adopted that style and could play it well was Jack DeJohnette was one of them. But Jack plays in all other styles as well. I mean, Jack can even play funk. And in recent years, I haven't heard Jack play so much in the looser John Christensen style. He still can, but in his own music, in his original music, he tends to do a different thing. The other drummer that could play in the John Christensen style, and maybe it's because he ended up playing in a lot of ensembles that included musicians or were led by musicians who had played with John Christensen. So, like, for instance, Jan Garbarek. Jan Garbarek had recorded with John Christensen. Eberhard Weber had played with John Christensen. And Mike DiPasqua ends up coming in, an American guy no less, coming in, and I would say filling that slot, but essentially he did. So I don't know if he was playing in that style before he started playing with all these European musicians, but he played that style. I got to see him play live once. Jan Garbarek Group, right around 83, I want to say, 1982, 1983. Jan Garbarek Group had put out an album called Paths and Prints, which is one of my two favorite albums by the Jan Garbarek Group. And John Christensen was the drummer. After the album came out, it came out about 8 or 9 months after it was recorded. Comes out, the band does, I guess, like a promotional thing to support the album. But John Christensen was not available, and Mike DiPasqua filled his role in the band. The other two musicians in the band, besides Jan Garbarek, was Eberhard Weber and Bill Frisell on guitar. And they had played on the Paths and Prints album. So when we got tickets to go see the Jan Garbarek quartet, I thought, I'm going to see my favorite drummer, John Christensen. And I went there, and Mike DiPasqua was there in his place, playing perfectly in that same style. I mean, my jaw dropped. And I wish they had recorded that gig or a gig on that tour, because he did the most interesting drum solo. It wasn't at all that, let me see how loud I can make this kind of drum solo thing, or even like the fancy fills that you see like the mainstream bebop drummers do. It was a very musical thing. And it was the only time I got to see Mike DiPasqua play live. I would have loved to have seen him many more times. He was so busy recording at the time. Now, again, you didn't have the internet to find out what else he played on. So I got to speak to him after the concert, told him how much I loved it. He told me about a couple things he had done, and I had to try to remember people's names. And he said, well, I made this album for ECM. I don't know when it's going to come out, for some German bass player. And I played on that album. And he told me about that. I don't think I remember the guy's name at the time. Lo and behold, probably a year and a half to 2 years later, I go into New York City, which I rarely do, to go record shopping in a store that had a lot of imports. And I'm just flipping through anything and everything there. And I find this ECM album that was only ever released in Europe. It didn't come out in America, by a guy named Eberhard Weber, which I've spoken about because this is one of my favorite albums. And I saw it was an ECM. It's a great album cover, too. And I'm looking at the names on here. And I'm like, well, I didn't know Eberhard Weber, who's a fantastic upright bass player. But Ina Kemenas, who's actually an American female vocalist, I knew her. I love her voice. She's a California girl, as it turns out, but I didn't know at the time. I thought she was a European. She had recorded with Bar Phillips and John Sermon an album called Journal Violin 2, which I love, and her vocalizations on that album are incredible. And I saw her on this album. And I see also there's a whole bunch of musicians. There's 6 different musicians, but I see Michael DiPasqua. And I'm like, I bet you this is the album he was telling me about. And I picked it up, based on, well, I know 2 of the musicians on here. It's an ECM. I'll probably like it. One of the best albums I ever bought. And again, I think this recently came out as downloads. They never put this out on CD. This is just a fantastic album. Eberhard Weber on upright bass, a guy named Heinz Sawyer on saxophone, a guy named Bob Deegan on piano, Harry Pepple on guitar, who I have now bought some solo things by. Harry Pepple's passed away, but this was my introduction to him, as well as Harry Pepple's partner, Werner Perchner, who's a vibraharp and marimba player. The 2 of them played together, Pepple and Perchner together over the years, even in duos. That was my first time I heard Perchner. Ina Kemenas on voice, and of course Mike DiPasqua on drums. Yes, fantastic album. I wish that were available on CD so badly. So I'm showing you some things from Mike DiPasqua now that are things that I've never heard him play on an album that I didn't like. A lot of people will know this album for some reason by Eberhard Weber later that evening. A lot of people have this as one of their favorite Eberhard Weber albums, and Mike DiPasqua plays on it. And at this point, it seems like Eberhard Weber chose Mike DiPasqua as being the guy. When I want to use a drummer, I want that guy. Even though he had previously, Eberhard Weber on his albums had previously used John Marshall, the drummer, and John Christensen as well. It seems like there's something about Mike DiPasqua's playing that Eberhard Weber loved. Now, I believe Eberhard Weber probably first heard Mike DiPasqua's drumming when Jan Garbarek hired Mike DiPasqua to play in his band. And from that point on, I believe this is the way it went, from that point on, Mike DiPasqua was the guy for Eberhard Weber. Like, really the guy. My second favorite album by the Jan Garbarek group, under the group name, and if you take a look, there's quite a few albums by group, is this album. It's Okay to Listen to the Gray Voice. And it has Mike DiPasqua on drums, Eberhard Weber on bass, Jan Garbarek on saxophones, and David Torn on guitar. It's the only time David Torn recorded with Jan Garbarek. It's my very favorite David Torn performance ever. I have bunches of his solo albums, group projects, but for the most part, David Torn is a bit of a wild man for me. He's a bit too distorted and rockish in general. But on this album, it's his most subdued playing and to me his best playing. It wasn't about like making a whole lot of noise and sounds and stuff like that. He was really the man. There's no keyboard player in here, so he's also kind of filling that void on the guitar. And he actually plays the Yamaha DX7 keyboard a little bit as well. But it's my favorite playing of David Torn, one of my favorite Jan Garbarek group albums, one of my favorite Jan Garbarek albums. Eberhard Weber's playing is excellent. Mike DiPasqua's playing is excellent as well. Mike DiPasqua played a lot of sessions, a lot that I still don't have. And then suddenly, and again, this is before the internet, suddenly just disappeared by the middle to late 80s. And I wondered for years, like, what happened to the guy? For some reason, it never dawned on me that maybe he had passed away, probably because at that point he was still pretty young. So I had to wonder what happened to him. And many, many years later, probably after the whole internet thing, so it took me a lot of years of like, where the hell is Mike DiPasqua? Eventually, pretty sure I read this online, so this was a lot of years later. Eventually I go online and I read an interview with him where somebody asked him just that. He was still around. Why aren't you playing? And he said, well, I'm an American guy that only speaks English. And most of the musicians that hired him were European guys, and you could see that from the history. From, Jan Garbarek is Norwegian, Eberhard Weber's German, the Eberhard Reutinger, and most of the musicians in the Eberhard Reutinger group there were German, I believe. He said he was playing in a lot of bands with a lot of musicians that didn't speak English well or at all, and doing a lot of tours overseas, so he's not even amongst a lot of English-speaking people. And he said he started to feel a little bit isolated from that. And I guess he wasn't in love with the lifestyle of touring so much. Because remember, these aren't, this isn't Fleetwood Mac touring, where every member's got their own hotel suite type of thing. Touring when you're a working musician, not making a ton of money, sucks. It's a lifestyle I never wanted. I never, ever, no matter how much into music I was, and even if I was into playing live and all that, even in my 20s, I never wanted to get into that touring and staying in crappy hotels and sharing rooms and dirty hotels and all that. That was never a lifestyle I wanted. So Mike DePasqua this is unfathomable to me because I love him as a drummer so much and as a musician. So Mike DePasqua got out of the music thing, and apparently his dad had owned a whole bunch of Subway, the fast food sandwich place. He owned a whole slew of Subway stores in a specific area. I want to say it's Florida, but I'm not sure. And his dad was always after him to work in the organization, like in management and all that, because he's got a job basically to hand to him, and he could go into the office type of thing and I guess do like a Monday through Friday thing. And after his experience of touring overseas and not being amongst people that spoke his language and all that, I guess it started to look good, that lifestyle, and that's what he went and did. So it looked like we weren't going to hear from him again, except at one point Eberhard Weber, the bass player who had loved his playing and wanted to use him on his albums, Eberhard Weber went through the stage where he was playing with the Jan Garbarek group as a member of the group, but not recording a lot of his own solo albums. He left this huge gap in his solo album period just because he felt he didn't have anything to say or have anything that he needed to put out there under his own name. So he didn't record a solo album for a long time, for a number of years. Whereas prior to that, he had been putting out a solo album like at least once every 2 years. And eventually, I want to say this is around 2000, Eberhard Weber decided it's time to make another solo album. He wrote some music, and he put together a band with Paul McCandless, which is, again, now we're going back to the gallery connection, and Rainier Bruninghaus on piano. Rainier Bruninghaus was the keyboard player that Eberhard Weber used the most throughout. If you take a look at Eberhard Weber's solo albums, all of them except one of them, I believe, that has keyboards on it. Keyboards are by Rainier Bruninghaus. And he contacted Mike DePasqua, which is amazing to me. And he said, I got to have you play on my album. And Mike DePasqua, this is like 2000. This is more than, or like somewhere around 15 years after Mike DePasqua was no longer playing. And he was hesitant to do so, apparently. But Eberhard Weber talked him into it. This is how bad Eberhard Weber wanted. Now, Eberhard Weber could have gotten a lot of really good European jazz drummers. He had played with John Christensen, who was still around playing, and he had played with John Marshall. So he could have gone there's a lot of guys that he could have gone. For some reason, he wanted Mike DePasqua. He had to have him. And he apparently wore him down to the extent that Mike DePasqua apparently flew over, I guess, to Germany and started playing again. He had to get his chops back. He hadn't been playing at all. So I don't even know if he had a drum kit at that point. And that made me so happy when I saw that, and I had read an article about that at the time of the album coming out. They did mention how he had kind of pulled, how Eberhard Weber had pulled Mike DePasqua out of retirement. and Mike DiPasqua had to start practicing again and playing, and he did it for Eberhard, which is just a wonderful thing, I thought. And I was hoping at the time that this was around 2000, and this album came out 2001 with Mike DiPasqua, and I was hoping, now we're going to see Mike DiPasqua back in action. And I don't know whether or not any gigs were played to support that album. I didn't see or hear anything about that. I thought and I was hoping that Mike DiPasqua would be around and playing again, but apparently he went back into retirement after that. He did the album, came back to the U.S. and went back to his management career, I guess. And that was almost it, except for sometime after that album, by the way, titled Endless Days, which came out in 2001, a very good Eberhard Weber album. Eberhard going ahead a few years, back to around 2007, I want to say. Eberhard Weber suffered a stroke and hasn't been able to play bass since. So Eberhard Weber, kind of figuring his career was over, didn't really record anything for a number of years. But Eberhard Weber had played as a member of the Jan Garbarek group for, I don't know, over, I want to say like maybe 17 years or something. It was a really long period of time. And he did well over 1,000 live performances with the Jan Garbarek group as the bass player. And at just about every one of these performances, at some point in the show, Eberhard Weber did a bass solo. Interestingly enough, one of their sound engineers had recorded many, if not most, of these concerts. And after Eberhard Weber suffered his stroke, this engineer went back, took the tapes that he had of these concerts, took off the bass solos, and I don't know whose idea it was initially, but Eberhard Weber was given these, very high quality recordings of the bass solos from these Jan Garbarek group concerts, and Eberhard Weber started looking at these and listening to these, picking out interesting ones, with the idea of taking the bass solos out of the pieces that they were played in. They were generally played as a transition piece from one piece ending, bass solo, and then it would go into another piece by the Jan Garbarek group. He would edit these bass solos out, find the interesting moments in them, and build little compositions from them. And he also had like use of digital delay, so there's more than one bass often going on in these bass solos. But Eberhard Weber also got the idea of playing a little keyboards. One of his two hands was good enough after suffering the stroke that he could play some light keyboard accompaniment. So at times he found these little bass solos and he would edit them to an interesting little short piece and would play some keyboards over it, thereby creating a new piece essentially from these bass solos from a period of like 17 years. And then he also got the idea of, maybe I could use a couple musicians here or there. So Eberhard Weber decided, I'm going to make an album with these bass solos, with some of these keys overdubs, and after doing so for a little while, he decided maybe I'll add a couple musicians to guest here and there. So the first album that came out of this concept was one called Resume, or Resume, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And I guess it was worked on around 2007 onward. It took several years before it actually came out. And Eberhard Weber started really deciding what pieces to use and what to overdub. It didn't come out till 2012. So there's a number of years of work in there. And Eberhard, as I said, wanted to get a couple musicians here and there, so we had Jan Garbarek come in and play saxophone on a couple pieces, which works really well. If you didn't know the history of these pieces, you wouldn't probably realize what they were, that they were just bass solos and they weren't meant to be these little pieces that they ended up being. But he also called up Mike DiPasqua again. Oh, Mike, come out of retirement again, because now this is a number of years after the Endless Days album, and it doesn't say specifically when the Jan Garbarek and the Mike DePasqua overdubs were put on, but somewhere between 2007 is when Eberhard Weber started working on the project, and 2012 when it came out. I would say it's probably closer to the end of that, probably like 2011 or so, that Garbarek and Mike DePasqua came down and played drums on a few pieces. And so once again, Eberhard Weber calls Mike DePasqua after Mike DePasqua kind of put the sticks down again after 2001 or so, and the recording of the Endless Days album, and he calls them back. And Mike DePasqua, being, I guess, a good friend, came back. And only plays on a few pieces here, but certainly worth hearing. I really love this album. And sadly, I believe to the best of my knowledge, this is the last Mike DePasqua performance that was recorded. Actually, probably the last two, which are 2000 and like 2011 or so, were both for Eberhard Weber. I'm not aware of anything that Michael did playing-wise in between those two albums. I don't believe he ever toured behind the two Eberhard Weber albums that he recorded, those last two things. It was just him coming out of retirement to play on the studio recordings. And so this is essentially kind of like, I guess, even though he only appears on a couple things, I guess it's epitaph in a way of Mike DePasqua as well. And a bit sad because of the conditions that the album were made under. This album only really came about because of Eberhard Weber's stroke. It wouldn't have come about otherwise. But I love, he made two albums in this fashion from bass solos. And Mike DePasqua only plays on the first of the two, which is this one. And it's wonderful atmospheric stuff. A bit sad, and then Mike DePasqua passes away in 2016, just about 4 years after this came out. Apparently didn't go back to playing anymore. And Mike DePasqua was only in his early 60s. And every time Eberhard Weber would pull him out of retirement, I was hoping it would be a permanent return, or at least he'd get the thing again, like, yeah, I got to go play. But the lifestyle stinks, of a working, touring musician. So, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to go that long. But I wanted to kind of dip into these connected people and the fact that, for many, 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 many years, I held out the hope that we would see a gallery album again, at least with the principal players, the four principal players, Paul McCandless, Dave Samuels, David Darling, and Mike DePasqua, and whatever bass player they want to use. And, for a lot of years that was a possibility until, we lost Mike DePasqua. Then we lost Dave Samuels. Now we lost David Darling, which leaves only Paul McCandless. So I don't think we're going to see another gallery album. Okay, guys, sorry for going on so long once again. But I really wanted to talk about some of my favorites and some things that are very emotional albums for me to listen to, actually. And I have a whole theme, so many musicians that I wanted to talk about, that I wanted to show favorite albums by that are guys that have passed away recently. I may continue on this thread, as difficult as it is. So thanks for watching. And hope everybody's doing okay in this deep freeze that we're in. And it's late February, so it won't last forever. And I'm okay with winter anyway. So take care, everybody. I'll be back at some point.